conversations with a couple of fairly large school districts lately, one in Oregon and one in another part of the country, where a school administrator has said to me, we need to know data about our assistive technology program. And I've begun to realize that when we talk about needing to know data about our assistive technology, we're really talking about several different kinds of data that we might be considering. And so it was a chance for me, because of these conversations I've been having, to actually think a little bit more deeply about that. And so you're getting today sort of a combination of several different presentations that I have been involved with or offered over the last several years. And some of the material in this webinar, I wanted to say as we got started, comes from our friend Penny Reed, who also lives here in Roseburg, Oregon, who does a lot of work with the idea of research-based interventions. Some of it comes from some work that Penny Reed and Jane Corsten and I did on called How Do You Know It, How Can You Show It, which is a different kind of data idea. And then some of it also comes from some work that I've been doing with Denise DeCoste. So if you're new to the ATTeams project, one of the things that's probably important for you to know is that as a field, we are really good at sharing. We're good at sharing information. Some of these slides were ones that Penny or Denise shared with me directly. Some of them are conglomerations of things, but I wanted to think about evidence and using data in some different kinds of ways today. So I hope this is useful to you, and I always want to say to this kind of webinar, and when we have the opportunity in a platform like Zoom to talk with each other, that I really appreciate your comments, your feedback. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. You have the ability in Zoom to unmute yourself, so there's no problem with your talking, and we'll be able to see you as we go through the webinar. So do join me in this conversation, because for today I think it really is a conversation. So let's get started. I said there were different kinds of data. And I'm curious about what kinds of information and data you collect at this point in time about the work of your AT team, about the work of your AT services. So I invited a conversation. I'd really love to hear from anybody who can tell us a little bit about how your team operates or the kind of data that you collect. I know some of you on this call are doing a fair amount of that, so please chime in, help me out here.
Well, I know in coming from my background, Gail, at the special school district, one of the main areas of data that we collected was for trial periods for students, and taking data to see if the tool that we were recommending was going to be a good one. So,
okay, so specific data about how a tool works for a specific child?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so individual child data, and that's certainly one thing that people think of when they talk about data collection. Anybody else? Okay, well, let's go on. I'll tell you some of my ideas about data collection and the evidence that we can be collecting as we're thinking about the function of our AT teams. As I thought about it, and as I had some of these conversations with special ed in large school districts, I started to realize that we really have three different kinds of evidence or data that's available to us as assistive technology folks, and that they each have their own role and their own place in our assistive technology services. But in the same way that when we say AT team, we often mean very different things based on how we function and how and the kinds of things our teams do. I think we might mean very different things when we say we're collecting data. So I wanted to just break that down to us. I think there is, first of all, data about the general use of the intervention. So it's what we're really talking about is research studies and different kinds of articles and things that tell us about how well a particular kind of assistive technology might work. We know there's a lot of research about augmentative communication, a lot of research about text-to-speech and speech-to-text. And if you really are interested in a particular area, you can search university databases or all the web in many different ways and find out about AT research. Now, AT research, that first kind of data in my mind, is what the federal law means when it talks about research-based interventions. And we're going to take a look at the wording in the law in just a minute. But let's talk about the other two kinds of data that we might be collecting in our assistive technology programs. The second kind is data about how AT works for an individual student. And that's the kind of data that Debbie mentioned, where we choose some assistive technology that we want to try with an individual student, and we look at their performance before the intervention, after the intervention. We collect some information or some data about how that particular tool works in a particular setting. If we're doing a good job and are as thorough as we could possibly be, which most of us never have the opportunity to do, but if we're doing a really good job of that second kind of data about individual student use of AT, we're probably looking at some of the research ahead of time to be able to say, well, based on what we know about this student and based on what the research says, this is probably a good option for this student. As we began to work in assistive technology, as I began to work in assistive technology way back before the turn of the century, we didn't have a lot of research about AT, so a lot of our work and a lot of our data collection was about trial periods and trying things out and seeing if we could see changes in performance. That's changing over time, and we now have some evidence that will help us make good decisions about individual students. The third kind of data that we're going to look at today is data about what your team does. Now, ironically, a couple of the directors of special ed who wanted to talk to me about data collection actually wanted this third kind of data. They wanted to be able to make decisions about how to allocate resources, whether or not to add additional staff to an AT program, or sometimes whether or not there were too many staff in an AT program. But those directors of special ed who wanted to talk to me really wanted this third kind of data. They wanted assurances, of course, that the work that their team was doing was having an impact on individual students, but they also needed some data about what the team does. So in our time today, we're going to talk about all three of these kinds of data in a pretty brief manner because we don't have a lot of time. but we're going to address each one. And I want you to, especially for those of you who are starting AT Teams programs or who are thinking about changing your AT Teams role, I want to encourage you as you talk about data to be a little bit more specific, to talk about the kind of data you're looking for, the kind of information that you need, so that you're sure that it matches the evidence that you want to give. And I have to stand up here and pull the window shade because the sun just started. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Data about the use of an intervention, or AT research. We've had a great emphasis in the past few years, and essentially since IDEA 2004 was passed, about using research-based interventions. That phrase is actually in the law, term of law, and it's an important one to think about as we start to ask ourselves the questions about how assistive technology affects different groups of students. So we're talking about aggregate data. If you're working in a school district that has a pretty intense PBIS program or a response to intervention program, however you call it, you're probably looking at some research-based interventions that can give us information. And there are, these days, lots of kinds of studies about assistive technology that are research-based. We need to know about assistive technology research because it helps us guide informed decision-making. If you have been a member of a PBIS team or an RTI team, one of the things that you probably look at as a group is, for your struggling students, what are the interventions that might have the most effect for those students based on their learning characteristics and the kinds of difficulties that they're encountering. So that same kind of RTI approach can apply to assistive technology services, whether it's inserted in to the interventions that your PBIS team considers, or whether it is a separate part of your separate assistive technology services. Research also can help us guide purchasing, and I'm going to give you an example about that in just a moment. So I'm going to skip over that and not talk about it too much right now. It can help you set program goals, both for your AT program and for your reading program or your Title I program, any of the specific programs where you are working to infuse assistive technology into the everyday routines and activities in the educational program. Research can also help us compare solutions. So those are good reasons to use research, but here's another one. Here's an example of how that might happen. So here's a story for you. Your special education director has a small amount of money to spend, small in terms of the district budget. So let's say $4,000. And he's come to you as a special education professionals group and said, how do you think I should spend this money? One of the suggestions of somebody in your group is to purchase access to talking books for all the middle school and high school students with an identified disability in reading. But another such suggestion is to purchase text-to-speech software, something like Read and Write Gold, or whatever the current version of Read and Write is, Read and Write for Google, for every computer in the school. Now, that's a fairly common scenario. It might have been about reading and text. It might have been about augmentative communication. I just worked with a program yesterday where they had to make decisions about spending $5,000 for children with complex communication needs. And one of the things we asked them to do in spending that money was to justify why they wanted to spend it based on what the goals for the children were and based on what research says about their particular goal areas. So this scenario, what should we buy to increase the reading skills of our middle and high school students, can actually be helped, this decision can actually be helped if we look at some of the research about how audio and text-to-speech helps students with disabilities. So one of the studies that this particular group looked at was a study by Boyle, Rosenberg, Connolly, and Washburn, and a whole bunch of other people. And by the way, you have a handout with all these research studies on it, so I'm not going to do a perfect job of citing them here because you have all the citations. The study said that if students only listened to text, it was not as effective an intervention for a group of students with learning disabilities as was the use of text-to-speech with highlighting of the print so that the student could both see and hear the text being read. Now, that same study did say that listening to audio text increased comprehension and vocabulary skills. So if we go back to the original question of how do we want to spend our money that we have for middle and high school students with reading disabilities, one of the things we have to do is look at the research like this and say, okay, what is our goal for those students? Is it to increase their reading ability? Or is it, which would require that they have the text-to-speech and the visual that goes with it? Or could we do something like audiobooks only? Because really what we want them to do is get the information and increase the vocabulary. The third suggestion that you see on this list was also the use of audio plus text plus training in note-taking. One of the things that this team had to do then was to take a look at what was their real goal for this particular group of students, and were they wanting to increase study skills as well as the reading and comprehension skills of these students. So they looked at the research, they looked at what the study said, and in this final bullet where they were suggesting also training and note-taking, they realized that they really didn't need any to spend any resources or spend any money. So they were able to insert that into part of the daily educational program without any kind of an expenditure. And so they went ahead and decided to do that with the purchase of text-to-speech software so that they could see, so students could see their text being read out loud. So that's one example. That's how research might help us make decisions about assistive technology. I've mentioned a couple times the citation and the federal regulation about peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. This is a requirement that in the actual IEP section of IDEA, and it says that the IEP team must make a statement of the special education related services and supplementary aids and services, which we all sort of know, but what we sometimes miss is this citation, the part that's in red, which is based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. So the federal government is asking us to think about what research says as we decide on the interventions and the supplementary aids and services that a student needs. And that emphasis on peer-reviewed research and research-based interventions has only grown since 2004 when it was first inserted into IDEA. So what about research? There's a bunch of types of research. One of the things that happens when I start to talk about data, and particularly about research-based interventions with some groups, is sort of their eyes glaze over. And so I don't want to make this your college statistics class. That is not what we're talking about today. But I do want to just give you a brief overview of the types of research that we might be looking at, because they each have their own benefits and their own uses. Some of them are research about the use of technology with individual students. Some of them are aggregate research about different kinds of topics. So I just wanted to give you some examples. There are teacher surveys about knowledge and attitudes, and one of the things we know about those surveys is that most people are very good reporters about their own knowledge and skills in a particular area. So if you ask teachers about their knowledge of assistive technology, as a rule, you get very accurate information. We also have surveys of people who use AT and what they feel about the AT and those kinds of pieces of information, which can help us in making decisions about how to choose AT for an individual student. There are reviews of research, synthesis of research, which is people often pull together all of the studies they can find on a particular topic, and they compile them all into one article. I find those incredibly helpful because it allows me to choose from those reviews of the research which things I want to know more about, and I can go and get those particular articles. There's research about the application of particular assistive technology solutions, and then there's research about the outcomes of particular kinds of assistive technology. So let's look at examples of each one of these quickly, and then we're going to go on to talking about data collection about individual students in terms of how our AT team might do that. But here's an example. So again, this is a study that you have on your reference list, which came as one of the handouts for this webinar. Here's a study by Ashton, Lee, and Vega about how teachers felt about assistive technology use based on how much training they had had in the area of assistive technology. So this, to me, is an incredibly useful study if you are, as a team or as an AT specialist, wanting to say to your supervisor, you know, we will be much more successful with our assistive technology services and our efforts to increase the use of assistive technology for students who need it in our school district if we can give teachers professional development in this area. So in this study, it was 2 different districts in Maryland, and the study found that teachers who had 40 or more clock hours, seat hours, of training about assistive technology reported that they felt assistive technology was an essential part of students' daily activities. Teachers who had not received training, any kind of training about AT, report that they felt AT was not important and they weren't confident in identifying and using AT with students, so they tended not to try. In the first school district, they also looked at the results of how many students in their district actually used assistive technology. In the first school district, 40% of the students in that with disabilities in that district were using assistive technology. In the second school district, where teachers had not received training, only 7% of the students with disabilities were using assistive technology. And you can guess that those might have been the more students with more complicated disabilities who sort of had an obvious need for assistive technology. So that was information that came from a survey, and then they did some follow-up survey information to collect data about how many of their students were using assistive technology. But I found that study incredibly valuable.
I do too, and I know that we're talking about using research and guiding our decisions, but this slide really hit me, because when we're trying to build competence and confidence and helping build collaboration and teamwork, this really tells us why it doesn't always work. You can't give somebody a brief overview and expect them to feel confident and comfortable with it. So this slide really gave me some aha moments that I'm going to use for justification for more training.
Great, and I'm hoping that many of your AT team folks who are on this call will see that same kind of connection. But also I hear from AT teams all over the country that they are having trouble often getting the time and validation to do a more comprehensive AT training approach. And we all have to figure out what works in our own system and in our own environment. But I think research like this is very valuable in helping us justify that need for assistive technology training. So you have that reference at the end of your excuse me, handouts, and let me know if you'd like some more information about it.
Thank you.
Let's talk about another kind of survey, a consumer survey. So in this study, students were surveyed about how important they felt their assistive technology was, and whether or not they were experiencing benefit from the use of assistive technology. These are some of the things that students indicated in this survey that I think were very valuable to know, and especially for those of you who are thinking about students in transition. There's a couple studies in this group that I think are very helpful in terms of thinking about transition. As we might expect, if we sat down and thought about our own teenage children or something, students place a real importance on experiencing immediate benefit from the use of AT. When they reported whether or not they liked or disliked the AT, a lot of it was whether or not they could see something happen right away. And I have this very visceral memory of a student I worked with years ago who was having a horrible time reading and with word identification, and I handed him a talking spell checker, and I said, you know, this is a way that, here's a tool that you might use, and here's some ways you might use it. Why don't you play with it and try it out? And so he started to mess around with it, and he typed in a word, and then he pushed speak, and the talking spell checker spoke the word for him. And he looked at me with just awe in his eyes, and all he said was, oh. And it was such an amazing experience. There's a kid who saw immediate benefit. Now, he went on to use all kinds of different kinds of assistive technology for reading, but to me, that was the perfect example of having immediate benefit from the use of it. But other things in this survey, students with disabilities didn't like their AT if it interfered with peer relations. Another thing that we might know at a gut level, but it's really good to have some research about it too.
Does that mean like looking different from their peers?
We'd have to go back and read the article. I think it was interfered with peer relations. So if it created a barrier, the kids who don't want to go to the back of the room to use a computer, or when the aide has to sit right next to them so that their friend can't. I think it was more of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But I would have to reread this article. This was a study that was done with 20 students with physical disabilities, so that's probably important to know. Those students felt like the need to maintain and take care of the ATs was sometimes perceived as a burden. It was the more maintenance there was, the less likely they were to be excited about the AT. But the most important aspect was whether or not the AT was accessible, and I want to say easily accessible when it was needed, and whether or not it could be integrated into everyday routines and activities. So that was the thing that students reported. Again, this is an example of a consumer survey that we might bring to thinking about what assistive technology we give to an individual student.
And it would probably tie directly to the reasons for technology abandonment.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And we're not looking at technology abandonment studies today, but this particular survey matches up beautifully with the abandonment research.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at a synthesis of research. Sometimes these are called meta-studies, where they take all the different articles they can find on a particular topic. Here's one. You see the citation, Kelly and Smith at the bottom. And this is one about the impact of AT on educational performance of students with visual impairments. They looked at 256 different research articles. And one of the things that this study looked at was whether or not the articles which were peer-reviewed, which means somebody who knows the topic had read the article and found it good to publish. But in that group of 256 articles, only 2 were really used a research design, and both of those were single subject design. So before the interaction, what was the performance? After the interaction, what was the performance? They found that a large percent of the literature in 2011 was stories, was anecdotal evidence about how good something worked for a particular group of kids, but not really true research in the sense that there was a control and a experimental group and things like that. Now, I do think it would be interesting to go back and see whether or not these folks have considered reviewing this particular study and adding more current research, because what we've seen since 2004 is a huge increase in the amount of true research that's done about assistive technology. Here's this is the second study by the same group of people. So you can see Kelly, this is just Kelly in the next study. And one of the things in this finding was that assistive technology was not provided to the majority of students with visual impairments who could benefit from them. And I cannot tell you how they made that judgment, but if you want to read this study, you probably find out more about that. AT was more likely to be provided if parents are highly involved. AT was more likely to be provided if the student was in a residential placement. So what it really meant to me was that students who had strong advocates were more likely to use high-tech and complicated assistive technology. So again, but that was a meta-study where they combined, looked at 256 and we're talking about application studies. This is true research. So here's one study where they said, does cognitive mapping increase students' grasp of critical information? Does cognitive mapping help? Does programs like Inspiration, do they make a difference? And in fact, this study did use Inspiration with high school students with significant behavior issues. You can see here the research was use of Inspiration software changed scores on chapter quizzes from less than 15% to more than 75%. So a significant increase in performance and learning, and also decreased task behavior. This is a kind of study that we think of, I think, when we think of research. Okay, well, we'll just talk over it. Okay, so that's one more research kind of study, and then we're going to here's a study about the impact of AT. It studied how students in special education reacted to having AT as part of their interventions. This was a quasi-experimental design. What it did was it promoted, it gave the kids the AT and then took it away, which is one kind of valid research study, but it makes me crazy when they do that, just to make sure it's working. This was a study done by an AT team. 13 students newly referred to the AT team had a variety of disabilities, and they looked at whether or not the IEP goals, performance on IEP goals improved based on whether or not the students had AT. And what they found, they had a whole list of interventions that they used in this study to look at whether or not it made a difference. And what they found was that of the all the items in the study that they looked at, AT was had a greater contribution than 9 other possible intervention studies. And if you want to know what those 9 other studies were, I want to encourage you to read the article. I don't want to take any more time to go over this today, but what we know is that AT can have a greater effect than some other kinds of things that we might try. Okay, so where do you get research? There are a number of journals that allow you to get research about assistive technology. This is a list of a few of them. The AAC journal is an amazing research journal. If you are a speech therapist or a speech and language clinician, or you work with one who has access to this journal, it has some really great things. And I always find things that I think, well, that's not just about AAC, that's about AT also. The RESNA journal has a journal called Assistive Technology that is also a good one for finding research. The ISTE publication, Journal of Research on Technology and Education, is a general education research publication, but it has a lot of interesting information that can be brought to our field. And finally, the Journal of Special Education Technology, the TAM journal, which is an online journal only, but has almost exclusively research about the use of technology. And technology and education. So those are some sources. Another place I want to encourage you to look is Dave Eddyburn's web page, which is called What Have We Learned Lately? And you can see the link down at the bottom of the page here. Dave does annual reviews of all of the research about assistive technology that's been completed in the past year. And that's why it's called What Have We Learned Lately? And you can see here that he has begun to have to divide it up. When he first started doing this, he'd come up with a list of like 20 studies, and now there's so much research coming out that that he's had to divide it into categories and things like that. So if you're looking for studies, it's a good place to go to look. We've talked about the research-based interventions. But the other category that we mentioned earlier was research about data about how a particular intervention applies to an individual student. And so let's talk some about that. Now, many of you who've been around for a while know may know this manual. How do you know it? How can you show it? How can you show it? Originally, this was a book for sale. It is now available for free for download at the Education website. What it talks about is strategies, specific things. How do I collect data on individual students? How do I do trial periods? The kind of things that you mentioned earlier, Deb, in terms of collecting individual student data. So that's available to you. It's been out for a long time. If you ever want to, we can do just a whole webinar on this particular topic. But for today, I wanted to talk about some other kinds of things that you might think about as you talk about collecting individual student data. One of the things that is available to you is the Quality Indicators for Assistive Technology has a section on evaluating the effectiveness of your AT services. Now, it says evaluating the effectiveness of your AT services, but I want you to take a look at the indicators themselves. So these are summary statements of the indicators. We really talk more about how the data is for individual students. So the number one is that the team shares responsibility for data collection. So how is it done? Quality indicators strongly would indicate that it should be a team effort. That the data on a specific student's use of assistive technology needs to be connected to student achievement and specific goals in the IEP. That it includes both quantitative and qualitative measures of change. So how much different, how many more words per page can type, but also how often does that happen, or what's the quality of the students' written sentences now? How do they do on the state assessments for writing? Things like that. We can look at our state benchmarks for information like that. The indicator is that the evaluation is done in more during naturally occurring and structured activities, not in a pull-out setting where it isn't a real use of assistive technology. Number 5, the data lets you analyze student achievement and see whether or not it's really making a difference. And if it isn't, we make changes based on that data. So, and then the 7th indicator views evaluation as a dynamic, responsive, ongoing process. Those are the quality indicators. If you've been a part of the AT Teams project, I'm absolutely sure you've used these indicators and the matrix itself to take a look at how your team does things and how your AT services are progressing. What I wanted to do today, though, was to start from this quiet list of indicators and move on to some suggestions for you about how you might gather that data, because this list of quality indicators is it's research-based. It was validated and has a lot of different kinds of good things in it. We have a lot of evidence that this is a valuable tool. But do that. Everything in the quality indicators is really a jumping off point. So one of the things that I think AT teams struggle with is this idea of how do we do these things. So the number 2, the team collects data on specific student achievement and related goals, evaluates across environments. So let's go on. Let's look at how might we list of indicators says. Here's one example. And Debbie, you mentioned it at the beginning of the webinar today. Here's a student data opportunity to have a trial period plan. But what I want to encourage you to think about when you think about your trial period is, can you do this electronically in any way so that you can collect data about the group of students you're working with as well as an individual student? Trial period forms in general specify the tool or tools that you're trying, describe the environments where they'll be used. They give some kind of a beginning and end period for the trial period itself, and always should say what it'll look like if it works. Now, in the trial period plan that OTAP developed years ago and that is available on the OTAP website, it also asks you to identify what are the things in a trial period that might indicate to you that you should stop the trial because it's not working. So that was added in response to a student with autism who we had given what we thought was going to be the perfect voice output device for his communication. And he started throwing it at people. And so we had to have a conversation about, well, we planned this trial period to be 6 weeks, and it's only been a week and a half, and he's throwing things, and his behavior's gotten worse. So sometimes we also have to say indicators of effectiveness and indicators that it's time to stop. So that's a typical trial period form. Here's one. This is the one that I believe is on the OTAP website. Yes, it is. Here's the web address for it. So a trial period plan, and you can see here those kinds of things that we talked about. This is just all demographic data about the student. But I wanted to show you a different kind of trial period plan. Here's where you summarize the results. Now, it's important for us to somehow be able to, as AT teams, to get this kind of information, I believe these days, into some kind of electronic format so that we can see the aggregate, not only the specific results for one student, but the aggregate of the kind of data that we're collecting for all our students so that we can begin to make some decisions about what we buy, how we approach training for some of the technology that we're using. And these kinds of questions on the end of this trial period form, what are the advantages of using the devices? What are the disadvantages? How long can the child be expected to use the device, are all things that have to be considered as we begin to look at individual students, but also can give us data points. I was in a marvelous webinar this week where a team in another state was talking about their AT process. And one of the things I wanted to mention to you, just because I enjoyed it so much, was they no longer call this activity a trial period. They call it making AT choices wisely. And there's a better phrasing of that in their process. But the process is identify a need, assess, and then choose wisely, which is way different conceptually, I think, than just saying, well, this is a tool that this child might use. Can they use it? Can they operate it? Does it have an effect on their performance? So there are other things. What are the disadvantages? Does it get in the way of peer interactions, as in that research study that we looked at earlier? Some things like that. But no matter what kind of data that you want to collect on your individual student and on your students as a group, you need some kind of a form like this, and ideally these days it's better if we can do them electronically in Google Forms or or SurveyMonkey, whatever electronic system you have available to you. We've almost all got them these days. Here's another form. This one I mentioned to you, I've been doing a lot of work lately with Denise DeCoste. So this is the Hyatt trial period plan that is still used in Montgomery County, Maryland. And they have this electronically, and the data is automatically dumped into a spreadsheet, so it helps them know what they're doing in their teamwork. And I wanted you to take a look at the categories here because they're similar to the other one. So the first category is what are you trying?